take you back to this year's annual report and accounts. Okay, they show that 77% of the cases that were received further investigation were closed within 1 year. But you're...
percent closed in 1 year, within 1 year.
Oh, Rob, did you hear? Yeah. Your target was 95%, so it's significantly down. And that's decreased from 81% in 21-22. Can I just say this? Over the last number of years, you've had an increase in budgets, unlike a number of other agencies. You've had sizable increase in staff over the last 5 years. You have no independent appeal mechanism apart from judicial review, so you largely mark your own homework. So what are the reasons? Why is it the case that you can't, with all those additional resources, without having the lengthy delays of external appeals, why have you failed to meet your target so significantly? Because you're almost a quarter of cases now not being dealt with within that year.
I think that Rebecca will come in on this. We don't mark our own homework with respect. We use
no independent appeal process.
We use the powers that are available to us to investigate impartially. If people don't believe we've done that, they have the right to bring legal process into the situation.
Which is almost inaccessible for most working people because of the cost.
Well, that is an issue for government, it's not an issue for me.
But that does mean, exceptionally,
and
you mark your own homework. It's an internal review process.
I don't accept that term. I think that's a pejorative term.
Well, okay, it's an internal review process, isn't it?
Well, it's not an internal review process in the sense that, first of all, we use clinical advisors externally.
You appoint them?
Yes, okay. Well, how else would you do it?
Independently.
Sorry?
Independently.
In what way?
Appointed by government or others.
What, clinicians?
Yes, if necessary, yes.
Well,
but there's no process here where someone can appeal on a decision of yours to an independent body other than judicial review, is there? That's the factual reality, isn't it?
It's not the same as marking your own homework, which suggests that we're conspiring
There's no independent review process of your decisions other than judicial review. And then as a result of that, even though you've had more money, you've had more staffing, you still can't meet your target with regard to dealing justice within a year.
But the key issue which you've not mentioned is that we have dramatically reduced the queue, which causes the delay in handling the cases, so that by the end of my term of office we'll be back to routine levels of allocating the cases. And sorry, could I finish?
Of course.
And without having appointed a significant number of new case handlers, we would not have been in the position to be able to retain the quality, reduce the queue, and to keep the processes going.
You've reduced the queue by your own decisions on what will go forward, and the only way that they will be in any way challenged is by your own internal processes of review. That's the case, isn't it? Because you're making the decisions about whether a case will go forward. You've reduced the queue as a result of making your own decisions. But the only way that will be in any way potentially open to challenge is as a result of an internal review yourselves or a judicial review, which most people can't access.
But you haven't mentioned independent peer review of what we've done, where specifically in 2022, the external panel came to Manchester and said they felt that we'd handled the post-COVID situation in the best possible way that we could.
It's not looking at individual cases, is it? That's looking at your overall performance. That's not a route for an individual constituent of mine, for example, who's had their case reviewed, thrown out at the early stage. There's no external review that's done of that.
There's no ombudsman service in Europe that I know of that has a process that you're describing.
I want to vouch sure we're the best in the world, to be honest. So that's irrelevant. The issue is whether or not people are getting the opportunity of having their case dealt with on time, and it clearly isn't the case now. Only 95% target, 77% performance. Is that good enough?
Well, it's pretty good in comparison to where we've been.
Well, why did you set yourself a 95% target if you can't meet it?
Well, given that we started off with a queue in excess of 3,000 and it's now down to just over 700 and reducing, I think that's
Mr. Behrens,
a pretty good performance.
Greatest respect, it's you who set the 95% target. You've only reached 77%.
Well,
that means people are waiting beyond a year for any decision from you. That cannot be right, can it?
We'd be criticised by you if we set lower targets, and you would probably say, well, you're just doing that in order to make yourselves look good.
That's a bizarre response.
In terms of the determination, I wasn't going to ask at this point, but I was. We seem to be detained on it. Why was the figure 95%
arrived at?
You could say, frankly, and I'd understand if you said it's an arbitrary figure. People pick for thin air all the time. Or was there a certain methodology behind it?
Can I come in on that?
Yes, please.
I think the first thing I'd like to say is that we recognise that, like many other public services, we have struggled through COVID, we have encountered difficulties, and because of that people have had to wait.
Yes,
and that is incredibly important to us, and we have real empathy for all the people who've had to wait, and it is precisely because of that that we have put so much resource and time and effort into addressing the queue and addressing the backlog. And as Rob says, we halved it by the end of last year. At the moment, we have a queue of about 770 cases, which means that by the end of this year, we will be able to deliver on the commitment that by the end of Rob's term of office, we'll be operating at effective operational levels as we should be as a BAU point.
And that therefore determined from that, to meet that criteria you described, requires a 95% figure in this instance. Is that
what you're sticking to? Sorry, are you sticking to I'm not trying to set you up here. Is 95% still realistic? Is that what we're saying?
The figures that measure which proportion of cases will be dealt with in how great a measure of time are basically Ombudsman standard. They do reflect the various different stages that cases go through when they come to us. The percentage of time within which we deal with different cases has been improving steadily last year and even during the first 2 quarters of this year, since we have put into place the various measures that we've already mentioned in terms of reducing the queue. We are an ombudsman of last resort, so everybody who comes to us has already been through a complaints handling service. At some point, you have to have a place where the ombudsman's decision is final. We actually go beyond what we need to do in terms of having internal review processes and ensuring that people get as much chance as possible to have their voice. One of the purposes of the work that we've carried out that Rob mentioned in relation to our public engagement advisory group is actually to understand better how to explain our decisions so people won't need to come to us with those reviews, and that will create a better service and a better relationship going forward. In relation, just one more point on the specific that you mentioned in terms of not taking forward lower level cases. I'm aware that the committee has been concerned about that. Our board has considered very carefully your comments because they were very keen to take them into account. They reviewed the data last year. They reviewed it again as recently as September this year. What colours our view of that is partly that we actually get relatively few complaints from complainants whose cases are not taken forward. We explain to them what the situation is. We don't take cases forward where we think that there is a limited amount of impact on the individual and where there isn't any systemic failings to be addressed. And an example of a case like that might be somebody who had to wait an extra half hour for a GP appointment. We do take cases forward where the injustice is limited, but where we believe there's a systemic failing. And an example of that was a recent case of somebody whose assistant's dog was not allowed entry to a hospital. But we do try to resolve quickly if we can without going through to investigation. An example of that was a recent case of somebody whose family were not informed when they were discharged from hospital, and we arranged, we talked to the hospital and agreed a settlement of £450 without taking the case forward to further investigation. Because of all those measures, we don't get complaints. We believe that we're acting in alignment with all other ombudsman organisations across the world who operate from a perspective of proportionality, balancing the need of their resources against the impact on public service improvements and better outcomes for people who we can often bring to a resolution sooner than we would if we proceeded with a full investigation of their complaint.
Thanks, Rob. That's really helpful. I don't want to labour the point, but if you've set yourself a target of 95% and you drop to 81% and now you've dropped to 77%, our role as a select committee is to hold agencies to account. So if I just finish.
Can I just one more point to that?
Mr. McDonnell, just finish his
Let me
question.
just finish. Honestly, could come back. There's no problem. What I'm saying is, our role is to hold agencies to account. When we see a drop like that, we'd expect a clarity on why that's happened, and then also the proposals you're putting in place to ensure that you meet that target, or, as the Chair said, if the target is not a reasonable one, inform us of that. Yeah.
I answer that. So I think one of the reasons for the stats reading the way they do is the lag effect of the cases we close. As we move towards improving the queue, the cases we're actually closing have been in the queue for a long time. We're now getting to a stage that we're reducing considerably the number of what we call aged cases in the queue. But while we continue to close them down, it's inevitably the case that the statistics will say that the cases we're closing are older and have been waiting for longer. What you'll see as we reduce the queue this year, and we're now in a situation where people are waiting only 3 months for their cases to be allocated to a caseworker, that you will see that stat will drop dramatically.
Okay. I understand the issue you raise about you being the element of last resort. Well, most constituency MPs are that as well. People get to us when they're frustrated or anything else. I just come back to one of your other targets. In the response to our previous report, you said that in the medium term, 25% of the cases you receive could be resolved by mediation with buy-in from organisations and complainants. And I think we welcomed that. We saw the role for mediation. But in 22-23, you didn't meet 25%. You only resolved 0.2% of cases through mediation. So what measures are you going to put in place to encourage mediation so you can meet that target?
I always take what you say very seriously, and I know you're not trying to set us up. We did not make a commitment to resolve 25% of cases this year. I came here and I made a commitment.
You said the medium term.
Yes, yeah. I made a commitment this year to double the number of, this last year to double the number of mediations, and we will do that again this current financial year.
But
hang on, let me finish, please. What we have done is we have put in place a system that now is able to be expanded, and because we have the people who now have the professional qualifications and the experience of conducting mediation. And our experience is unique in Europe, and I went to Barcelona a couple of weeks ago because I was invited to explain how European ombudsman services could use mediation. So we've already made big strides in explaining to the office, people who are not engaged in mediation, what are the benefits of using mediation in routine investigations. That is very important in terms of improving our flexibility and our profile. The big challenge for us is that mediation cannot take place without the agreement of both parties. And what we know from the post-COVID situation is that the NHS has been reluctant to commit people to be engaged in mediation because they think, particularly clinicians, that it's not a terribly good use of their time. Now, I think that's unfortunate. I think it's wrong. But without that consent, we can't take the issue forward. So what we're trying to do now is to think about how we can publicise the success of mediation without betraying the personal confidences that people want if they go through that process, to ensure that people understand that it takes less time, it's more successful in terms of outcomes, and it can have a positive effect. So I retain the view that my successor can honourably seek a 25% mediation, but we're already ahead of the game as far as any other Ombudsman service is concerned.
You have nothing but for support from this committee, as in the past, with regard to development mediation. But as a committee, if you tell us in the medium term, and I take that's within a limited number of years, you're aiming for 25%, and a year on from telling us that objective, you're only at 0.2%, you can understand why we're asking questions, can't you? And even though that might be a doubling of our time, even if you're doubling each year, it's going to take another decade at this rate.
It depends how you define medium term, but there's no cynicism. There's no cynicism in this. We have, as I said,
look. Sorry, if I might mediate between Mr. Behrens and Mr. Behrens on this, I think we're at risk of violently agreeing with one another.
That's right.
And I think, therefore, what I would wish to hear perhaps from Mr. Behrens is the efforts that the Ombudsman is going to, with the health service, with government departments, to showcase the success of mediation, and therefore how that 25% might be reached.
So on January the
demonstration of the success of mediation.
on January the 16th and 17th, 4 countries, ourselves, the Estonians, the Dutch, the Greeks and the Slovenians, are meeting in Manchester to launch the International Ombudsman Institute Learning Academy, and the first 2-day training program is about mediation and how to develop it in ombudsman institutions. And we're leading it because no one else has the skills to do that.
Could I ask then, in your experience, particularly with the health service, where you mentioned the reluctance on the part of clinicians to engage in this process, how are you finding that? How perhaps are you, not just within individual trusts, but with ministers at the Department of Health as well?
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult.